Hey everyone, welcome back. In the previous episode, we worked on capturing the voting poll form, which is needed to create the voting poll, and then we went ahead and started to display the statistics for the voting poll. In today's episode, I wanted to cover the actual voting part. So the last third interactor that we have here, let's go ahead and plug it in. So as it stands on this page with the statistics, that's where we can do the voting as well. And if we go ahead, click on the counters, press F12 to go to these counters, we'll see the type counter statistics. So let's just make sure that we can identify the specific counter that we're going to vote for, right? So I'm going to press F12 on here, and I'll see that there is no real ID or an identifier to sort of say, right, this is the counter that I want you to submit your vote for, and a name is not really a good identifier because in different counters can have the same name. So as it stands, having an identifier on the counter statistics is going to become a business requirement, okay? So what we're going to do first is we're going to go into the tests section and into voting system.tests and counter manager tests, because this is initially what's going to do the conversion with getting the statistics and stuff like that. So once we're at the get statistics function, if we go in there, we will see the function that is doing the conversion of counters into counter statistics. And if we go and look on the counter, we will see that the ID is not here either. Now, I mentioned this previously in the series that having the ID on the model is okay. You don't necessarily have to go and put yourself through the pain of not having the ID and using the property function with the core, but I prefer to, just as a personal exercise, to exclude them until I actually need them, okay? And in this situation, I'm actually going to need it without adding much change. So let's go ahead, and in our counter manager tests, what we're going to do is add another one of these tests, and I'm going to say get statistics includes counter ID, okay? So you can combine all of these tests together. I'm going to keep them separate as just kind of those beginner foot in the door tests. Just as another example, this is what you can do, right? So we're going to say statistics ID, and for a counter name, we'll change this to counter ID, and we'll create something else here as well for this counter ID. So we'll create integer counter ID. I'll change this to 1, and I'll assign this ID to this counter ID. Now there's going to be a couple of things here. Neither the counter statistics nor the counter ID have the IDs, okay? So what I will need to do is create these properties, all right? So let's go into the counter. Let's create a property. Let's create an ID property here. And again, we'll go into statistics. So we can go and get statistics. Go to get counter statistics class. Create a property, integer, ID. Okay, so once we have the IDs, let's go ahead and run the tests to make sure that the test is failing before we start to actually fix it, right? Maybe what we wanted to do is actually already happening. Okay, so seems a little bit unlucky. Of course, it doesn't, so we're gonna have to go and fix up the ID. So let's go ahead, pin this here. We're gonna go into get statistics, and right over here, we'll just bang on this ID here and rerun this test. Okay. So with that, I'm confident that I'm going to be getting the identifier of the counter on my front end in the counter statistics object, and now I can basically have a way to pin my votes against a counter. So let's go ahead and close everything here, and we'll start anew. We'll again go to the poll page because this is originally where I wanted to do the voting, right? And what we're going to need to do here is we're essentially going to need to grab the counter ID. So here we have the ID. And we'll need to have some sort of an action. So we'll have to create a button or something, okay? So we have the button, and ideally we would want to submit this value as part of a form. So what we can do here is, if I type in form, I'll put the counter ID here, and I'll just create a hidden input field that for the name, I will just assign it to some counter ID as a parameter in the controller. Sorry, not the controller, I forgot we were using Razor Pages. So what I want to do is use counter ID, and for the value I want to specify my counter ID. So here's the value, and this is the property that I'm going to bind it to once I send it back to the backend. For the form, let's go ahead and check out poll CS.html. Just like in our index CS.html, whenever we want to use the HTTP post method, we have to prefix the onPost thing. So we don't actually have the onPost function here. So let's go ahead and create a public onPost. I'm going to provide my counter ID parameter here, and then from services, I can go ahead and grab my voting interactor, right? So I can call it interactor as well. And here for the interactor, I can go ahead and call the vote function, And let's go ahead and see what the vote actually looks like, right? So the vote is going to comprise of the user ID and the counter ID, okay? So we haven't actually gotten to that point where we have a concept of a user in our application, but we'll get there. So for this moment, we're just going to mock this functionality out, okay? And what mocking means is essentially you're going to simulate as if a user is doing this, right? So let's go ahead and create a new vote object. I'm going to remove this model's namespace and I'm going to just import it. Okay, let's go ahead and pop a semicolon here, and for the counter ID, we'll just assign the counter ID here. So usually what you do when you add a new piece of functionality in, if you're not sure if it works or not, go ahead and put a breakpoint here. We're going to go to the poll page and we're going to make sure that the form is going to be intact and ready to post there. So let's go ahead and specify the method post. And for the action, we don't actually need it. We will need to get our button nice and ready. So let's call it vote. And for the type, we will say submit. Okay, so what I'm expecting to do when I'm going to press this button, it's going to submit this form. And the only value in this form is this counter ID. And this is the parameter that I'm going to be binding it to, right? So this counter ID. I don't need to do a bind property with the vote object, how I did it in this index.cs HTML form with this request in this form. I don't need to do that because this is a simple enough thing for one variable, okay? But yeah, let's go ahead. We'll keep the breakpoint here. And as I said before, the from services thing, we might forget it. I'm pretty sure I brought it in the last episode, but it's always a good idea to just go into your startup and check. So we got the voting interactor there. Okay, nice. So it will be able to be injected into here. Let's go ahead and run this. So let's go ahead and go big on this one. Best sauce. What's your favorite sauce, right? Barbecue, ketchup, sweet and sour. Hard decision, but I don't know what I will pick. So here we have our best sauce voting. We're going to go into here and now we're going to think, what are we going to vote for? Well, for me, it's a no-brainer. I love barbecue. And again, we're going to run into the 400 error. If you remember what it was before, it's essentially us not having a form validator or verification token on our form, right? So what we want to do is go in our form here and just say html.anti-forgery token. Let's go ahead and put the function here. And what we'll need to do here is unfortunately rerun the application, right? So Ctrl-Shift F5. Too bad for the grand finale, I already spoiled my favorite sauce. But what's your favorite sauce? Right, make it fun for yourself. Ketchup, sweet and sour, best sauce. Let's go barbecue. Alright, so we're on the on post. Let's go ahead and take a look at the counter ID. And it looks like it is null, so what we can do is go back to the page, whip up our DevTools, which you do with F12, where you can right click, inspect, and then you're gonna go on the elements and you can go back on the console, whatever. We're gonna go in the div, we're gonna take a look at the form, and we're gonna see that the counter ID is null. We're gonna go to the next form and we're gonna see that the counter ID is not null but 0 here essentially as well. So what is most likely happening is that we're not actually retrieving this out of the database, which is what we should be doing. So let's go ahead, close this down. We're gonna go into our database tests. We're gonna go into the voting system persistence tests. And what I want to find here is essentially a test that is responsible for getting the counters, or rather the function that is going to be then using the counters for the counter manager to convert the counter into counter statistics, okay? And that specific function is going to be residing in the return saved poll with counters. So what I want to make sure here is that the counter 1, the ID that it's going to have is going to be equal to 1, and that the counter 2, it's going to have the same situation, but the ID is going to be 2, okay, because that's the order that we save them in. Now we can go ahead and run this. I obviously lost my test window, and there it is, so I'm going to find it. And let's go ahead and run all of our tests. So we have the one failing tests. Let's go ahead and take a look at it. All the way down here, expected 1, actual 0. So the get poll function is failing. Let's go ahead and press F12. We're not actually extracting the ID into here. So let's go ahead, grab the ID, and we're gonna take it from the Y here, which is the counter here, okay? So let's go ahead and save that. I will bring all my tests back into the field of view and I will run them all again. So it looks like this test is failing for a reason I don't know yet. So let's go ahead and try to run it in isolation. Okay, so if we click on this red little thing, we can see the line it's failing on. And I can see that I have actually selected counter 1, so it's still checking counter 1 ID, right? So very ideal if you don't want to think too much. Right, okay, it's running. Let's go ahead and run all of our tests for the grand finale. There we are. Okay, so let's go ahead and drop that down. Run our application. Here we are. Let's go ahead again with our sauces. Submit. Let's go to the best sauce. Let's confirm that our IDs are indeed here. So I'm going to go into form. I can see 1 here, I can see 2 here, and I can see 3 here. So let's go ahead and confirm that barbecue is indeed the best sauce. So here we have 1. Let's go ahead and continue this, and we're gonna run into a similar issue here where we're not actually displaying the statistics here. This is the kind of stuff you're gonna catch on to, but let's go ahead and run this. Object reference not set to an instance of an object. We know what's happening here. Let's go ahead and just return RTP. So redirect to page. You can see how it's highlighting the capital letters here. This is how you can select your keybinds, right? It works for virtually anything. And we're going to redirect to /poll. And one of the route parameters we're going to supply, and we'll have to supply a ID here to go back onto this page. So what I would like to do is let's go ahead and just uncomment this. Hopefully it will still let me hit the breakpoint, and it does. What I want to do is I want to find my HTTP context request object, and I want to see what the ID is or how I can extract it from the request. So I'm going to take a look at the request. I'm going to try to find the route or path where this one is residing. So let's go ahead and take a look at path, okay, because we can see the one there already, and we can see the one on the end. So we could probably try to redirect to just this URL. So let's try that. We're going to go down here. We're going to say return, redirect, and we're going to say just the same place. So let's go to the request, path, and let's grab the value. Now let's make sure that we change this to an iAction result. We're going to restart the application with Ctrl-Shift-F5. I'm no longer enthusiastic about my barbecue sauces. Let's go ahead and try to vote on this. I'm going to press F5 here. And I'm going to end up on the same poll, right? So I can see that I am displaying the statistics somewhat correctly, I guess. Let's try to vote on something else. I'll press F5 again here. So I can see the percentage is being dealt out somewhat correct. I can see also that it's not letting me vote for the same sauce. However, it does let me vote once on each sauce. I guess it's not necessarily wrong or correct depending on what kind of voting system you want. But again, you can adjust that through the test cases that you have. So for this, we would create a test case that would say something like, can only vote on one counter in the poll, or something like that, right? But I'm not going to bother with that. I want to actually go and take a look at the user aspect of this. So let's go ahead and close that. So what I want to do is I want to actually create an identity for my user, okay? I'm not going to go too deep into logins and everything like that. I'm going to start with what I talk in the basics episode of my authentication tutorial series, and we're going to do something super simple, okay? We're just going to create a page where we can log in, right? So let's go ahead and add a page. It's going to be a Razor page. We're going to log in. You can call it entrance. You can give it whatever name you want. This is essentially like an information gateway or an information wall where I'm going to ask some information of you in order to use our website, okay? So we're going to create the login page, and all I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a form, and again it's going to be an action post action. We can delete action since we're going to be posting to the same Razor page, and then here all I want to capture for is an email, okay? So type, we can say email, name, I'll say email again. I'm not going to forget the HTML anti-forgery token because I already made that mistake twice, okay? And let's go ahead and say something like enter here. And then let's not forget to submit the form with this. We can then click on the login model, press F12, and create our public iAction result, since we're going to be redirecting to a different page, hopefully our index page. And here I'll say on post. I'll supply my email thing. I'm not going to add any validation whatsoever here as well. I'm going to make sure that I'm going to be redirecting to page. So return, redirect to page / index, where I can start creating my votes or voting on voting polls. Okay, so all I want to do here is essentially create an identity. An identity is something that represents a user. Okay, let's say you went to one school, who you are known as in that school by the people there. That's one identity. If you go to another school or another website, you are known by a different identity, and it's how you may act different with different people. It's how you have different information on different websites, okay? It's just the nature of being able to recognize who you are, okay? And your attributes of who you are, so let's say your name, your email, your hair color, etc. We store those in claims. We'll create a claim list, which is essentially a list of your attributes or a list of features. It's a list of something that you claim to be. It's a collection of your claims. So you claim to have blue eyes, white hair, whatever. These are something you claim to be, okay? Because we just currently collected your information. You said this is your email. It might not even be a real email, but we're going to say this is one of those things that you claimed that you have, okay? And here we're gonna supply a new claim, and Microsoft by default recognizes a few claims. One of them are email, and if we press F12 on here, we're gonna see each of these claims are represented by a big string, okay? But this sort of gives you static typing if you want to then extract this claim from the cookie. You can also go ahead and opt in for your own claim, so creating something like a public class my claims, and we're going to create a public const string email, and we're just going to make sure that we say it that it's email, and then we can go ahead and start using our own list of claims, okay? And it's just going to be a claim type, and that's how it's going to get stored in the cookie, okay? But I'm going to go ahead and opt in for the Microsoft's option. And then we know what type of claim you're making, so you're saying this is my email, and then you're saying, okay, what's the actual value? So it's a key value store, same as JSON, key value store, same as a form. So you have a form here, it's a key and the value that we inputted, okay, and that gets transmitted over the wire. So there's a lot of these key value stores, as well as a dictionary. It's a recurring theme in the programming world. But essentially, once we have a few claims that you make about yourself, what we want to do is we want to create an identity, right? Which is essentially just a collection of claims. That's what your identity is. It's just what you claim to be. But then essentially what a claim's identity is a collection of those claims, right? So let me actually rename this to claims. And then we give it a name that we say that it's a voting system collection of claims. So this is where I bring it back to that example of you being in one school, you being in another school, you using one website, you using a different website, and you're a different sort of person in each of those scenarios. You talk with different people, you communicate with them differently, you do different things at different places, and that sort of builds up your identity. So here, this is your identity before the voting system, okay? And then finally, we go ahead and create a principal, which is essentially kind of like a claims identity is a collection of claims. Now we can have a bunch of identities. To aggregate them into one place, it's going to be a claims principal. So claims principal, let's go ahead and put this here, and we're going to supply as part of our parameters our identity here, okay? So once we have the principal, what we want to do is we want to use one of the functions available in .NET Core on the HTTP context and create a cookie and the authentication session. And exactly on the HTTP context, we're going to access the sign-in async function, and we're going to provide our principal here, okay? We'll then press Alt-Enter, and we import the using ASP.NET Core authentication package, and we're all good here. Notice this is async, so what we'll need to do is create the async task function here. Make sure we await on this. And at this point, what I'm going to do on my poll CS HTML CS, I'll close everything else to essentially narrow it down to these two. I'm going to put a breakpoint here to make sure that you can see how we're then going to extract this email and use it as a user ID. Okay, let's go ahead and run this. Okay, so on here, I'm going to go ahead and go onto the login page. I'm going to enter my email. Let's pick a good one. So when we try to use the sign in async method, what it's essentially trying to do is deal out a cookie. Much like we can recognize what route we're going to when we supply a route, if we want the services for creating cookies and then being able to recognize what cookie that is that's getting supplied with the requests and what identity is in there, and to be able to extract the claims from them, we need the appropriate services and middleware. Okay, I go well more into detail about this in my authentication series, so I highly recommend you watch that if you haven't already. And what I'll do in here is essentially add a service that will take care of most of the authentication features, and much how we have a fine-grained selection between, right, do we want controllers or do we want controllers with views, or do we want razor pages instead of controllers with views? We can have different types of authentication like cookie, OIDC, JWT, Bearer, Facebook, Google, Microsoft external authentication, tons of them, right? So here we're gonna just opt in for one of the most simpler ones, which is the add cookie authentication schema. So you will see here, if I hover over add authentication, it will be an authentication builder where I can then go ahead and add a cookie provider essentially, which knows how to handle cookies. Okay, so here I'm going to go ahead and specify the name of this. So authentication schema, this is going to be cookie, and in the add authentication method I can specify the default schema. So what I'm saying is there could be different ways to authenticate. Here I'm adding the base services. Here I kind of add the services that will consume the base services to provide the cookie authentication. Here I'm saying, right, for the base services, overall, the default schema that you should be using is the cookie schema, where the name that we have set for this authentication schema should be this cookie schema, okay? So that's the service wiring up part. Again, I go into much more detail in my authentication series, so go ahead and watch that. And here what I want to do is I want to essentially ask of my application, once I know where the user is trying to go, I can sort of see the controller that it's trying to go and stuff like that. I want to be able to ask, right, use authentication. So here we're going to find out who the user is, right? When we authenticate, we give the user an identity, okay? We check the user's identity. And then we want to find out if you're allowed to go somewhere. So this is when we ask, are you authorized? We might know who you are, right? You might be Obama, you might be president, but you're not getting in my cookie drawer, all right? Those are my cookies. I don't care who you are, unless you're me. But at that point, I'm going to be passing authentication and authorization. So we got those two pieces. Let's go ahead and run our application and make sure this works. So again, on here, I'm going to go to the login page. I'm going to use a nice email address. And here I am. Once I'm signed in, what you can do is go into your developer tools, into the application section. As a developer working with authentication, this is probably one of the most important places that you're going to be spending your time in, right? So the ASP.NET Core cookie is that cookie that's being created for the authentication session. And inside here is your email claim, okay, encrypted. And the services that we have added essentially take care of encrypting and decrypting this cookie at runtime and finding out what kind of information is in here, okay? So now that we got this, let's go ahead and quickly fill this out because we'll have to restart this one more time for the voting parts. Let's go to this title, let's go to vote, and here we are on our breakpoint. How do we get the email? Everything is in the HTTP context, okay? HTTP context is your friend. It can be found in your controllers, in your pages, and if you inject the iHTTP context accessor, you can access it in your services, okay? So we'll go into this. My keys are not working, or rather Visual Studio is not working. Okay, so Visual Studio woke up. Essentially what we want to do is take a look at the user that apparently has crashed here. Let's go and look at the HTTP context. I guess we're not going to be able to take a look at the user. Let's go ahead and continue here, and I'll just vote one more time. And hopefully we will be able to see the user. Okay, and there it is. And you can see, you can notice that the type that it is a claims principal. Okay, this is the exact type that we have created here and we set it to HTTP context right, save this type, okay? These are just the tools that .NET Core provides, and again, I teach more about this in the authentication series, so I highly recommend you go watch this. I'll leave a link in the description, okay? But we have the user here, and what we'll have here is we'll have our identities. Again, this is a list of identities that we have provided, and we have the one identity, and here we can see the claims, so we can grab the claims from here. We have the claims here. If we took a look at the result view, we can see the email address here, and we have identities here. Again, we have multiple identities. There's so many places we can grab our claims from, okay? Multitude of places. And how do we grab a claim? Well, we know its type. We have assigned its type here. So we can grab this class right here. We can go into policy.html, and the user object, much like the request object, we can either go ahead and find it on the HTTP context like this, or it's available to us straight up like this. Okay, and in here, just like we saw in the debugger, you can what you can do is actually leave your debugger on, and while watching through the locals window, you can take a look at the user's object in the locals window. You can see the properties that it has, and then just try to navigate to that property and try to use that property. You grab the property, you take a look at its type, you see the properties that this property has, and then you can see, oh, claim, right, what can I do with a claim? Oh, when I create a claim, it has a type and a value. Oh, there is that type property. Okay, let's go ahead and use link to extract a claim, because there's going to be a list. And what do we do when we have lists? We use link. Right, so first our default, we're going to grab the first claim, where the type is going to be the type that we have initially assigned it to be. We don't have the namespace for the claim types. Let's go ahead and assign it here. And here what we're going to return is a claim. What we actually want to do is grab the value, and this is going to be the string of the email. Okay, so here again, here we can go ahead and store this email in a variable. And we're going to grab the user ID and just assign the email here. Okay, so now let's go ahead and run this. Quickly fill this form out. Certainly the oo sauce is my favorite sauce. You can see that we have a null reference exception here because we haven't logged in. Notice that the cookie is no longer here, the cookie for authentication. One way that you can persist it for browser closure is make it a persistent cookie. So on the sign-in function, if we have a row, we can see that there's overloads, so there are different implementations for this function. On one of them, we'll see that we can provide authentication properties, okay? And for these authentication properties, we can see the is persistent option. If you set this to true, that means your cookie will be a persistent cookie, so when you close the browser, it is no longer removed from the cookie list of this website. So the next time you log in, your authentication session is persisted through browser closure, okay? And that's essentially why it's called persistence, right? But where were we? We were on the policy.html. We wanted to log in. So let's go ahead and log in. We're not doing any validation of the email if it's real or not. Let's go ahead and just go here and vote. And here we'll see that the email that we're extracting is the email that I've just put in. And we're going to assign that as the user ID. We're going to skip on here. We're going to do another vote. Email is still here. And we're going to skip on, right? So we can vote for different counters, but not for the same counters. I don't know if that was the intended functionality, but I know that, for example, votes in a Facebook chat essentially are this voting. So again, this is up to you how you're going to wire it up. This was more about hooking up your components into the ASP.NET Core application. And the user authentication is obviously just a little bit extra. Please take note, though, that, for example, a service like this, the claims identity and the claims principal, they live in a Microsoft ASP.NET Core, right? So these applications right here, they don't necessarily know what ASP.NET Core is. So if you're going to try to do authentication in your application or your database layer, be careful, because then you might be bringing in a big package into that library to accustom that functionality, and it's a dependency. So it might not mean much to you, but go ahead and try and do it. Maybe you'll find success with it. But yeah, this is essentially it for this episode. If you enjoyed watching it, leave a like, subscribe. If you have any questions, make sure to leave it in the comments section. Don't forget to join the Discord channel, link is in the description. And as always, I'll see you in the next episode.